The face development in embryology is one of my favorite topics because it is such a sophisticated process that involves multiple moving pieces that need to come together at the right time and make complete fusion. So let's talk about this. Towards the end of the 4th week in development, if we were to look at the developing face from the frontal aspect, this is what we are going to see. It kind of looks like a Pokeball. The face at this point in time is comprised of 5 lumps of tissues called the frontonasal prominence in the cranial end. This is the largest piece. And the 2 bilateral maxillary prominences and the caudal end called the mandibular prominence. The mandibular prominence initially forms as 2 separate bilateral lumps that tend to grow relatively quickly towards each other, and they will fuse in the midline. So by the end of 4th week, we'll have just a single mandibular prominence. But recognizing that they did come from the bilateral aspects that grew towards each other and fused relatively quickly. At this time point, we have a singular depression in the middle of the face called the stomodeum. This is the depression that will eventually give rise to the future oral cavity. This space is lined by the ectoderm all the way around. And if we were to stick our finger into the stomodeum, it would be stopped in the dorsal end by the oropharyngeal membrane that temporarily separates the primitive oral cavity from the future pharyngeal space or the beginning of the foregut in the back. You'll also note at this time point, the face doesn't look like it has any nose, right? So we didn't have any nose, and our eyeballs are not visible from this aspect because our eyes are forming on lateral aspects of our face, so much like a fish. Soon thereafter, though, we have the transformation of these 5 lumps fairly quickly. One of the first things that happens towards the end of week 4 is the formation of bilateral depressions in the frontonasal prominence. So I'm kind of replicating that by sticking my 2 fingers into the frontonasal prominence like this. So what we end up with are 2 bilateral depressions on lateral aspects of the frontonasal prominence, and these depressions are called the nasal pits because they are going to become the future nasal cavities. Relative to these 2 depressions, you'll note that there are some elevated circular ridges around the nasal pits. So those elevated ridges, circular ridges, are called the nasal prominences. These are the humble beginnings of our nose. Moving into the mid-5th week or so, there's been quite a bit of transformation. So that transformation, first and foremost, includes the maxillary prominences growing relatively quickly. See? So going from really small bilateral aspects, they are accelerating their growth. And what that does is it pushes the right and left nasal prominences towards each other in the midline of the face. And because the maxillary prominences are growing so quickly, it's also kind of pushing the developing eyeballs towards the midline. So from completely lateral aspects, the eyes are starting to move towards the front of the face. And we'll also note that from the mandibular prominence, we have 2 little bumps that have formed. These structures are called the lingual swellings that will eventually give rise to our anterior tongue. At this point, if we were to look from caudal to cranial aspect of the developing oral cavity, the future nasal cavities are still completely separated from the oral cavity by this wall that is formed by the frontonasal prominence, so that there's no direct communication between the oral and nasal cavities. This will quickly change though. In the next week or so now we are going into about week 6-ish, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue or the lateral lingual swellings have grown even larger, so they're taking up almost the entirety of the oral cavity. And from the maxillary prominences, we're seeing these little nubbins or processes that's grown caudally on either side of the developing tongue. These 2 structures are called the palatine processes. These are, of course, the extensions of the maxillary prominences. And even at this point, we can appreciate that the nasal cavities are still completely separated from the oral cavity where the tongue is occupying that space. This will change fairly quickly. So by about week 7, we have pulled the mandible and the tongue down and away from the face to demonstrate the communication now occurring between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. So if we were to look up into that space, the roof of the oral cavity is now perforated. So this happens by about week 7. So this opening between the oral nasal cavity is called the primary choana. This allows really fast growing tongue to essentially occupy the temporary space in the nasal cavity that's available. A lot of fast growing organs in our body will find space and just grow into it because space is premium in embryonic body. This is happening around week 8, almost into week 9. Looking from caudal to cranial, we can appreciate that large opening through which the tongue is growing into the nasal cavity. Moving into week 9, something changes where the mandibular prominence starts to grow rapidly. So much so, it has now gained that ramus of the mandible. What that does is it pulls the tongue down and away from the nasal cavities. And that allows these palatine processes that were on either side of the developing tongue to swing up towards the midline and towards each other and start to fuse. This starts to happen around week 9. So in real scanning electron micrograph, when we look up at the developing palate, we can appreciate the palatine processes that are starting to grow towards each other, typically in the middle, and then the fusion kind of zips anteriorly and posteriorly, or ventrally and dorsally. So at this point, we can see that the future palate is made up of the portion of the frontonasal prominence and the 2 palatine processes of the maxillary prominences that are coming together. Transferring it to this Plato model, the secondary palate comes from the fusion of the right and left palatine processes that have completely fused by now, and then the primary palate that comes from the frontonasal prominence. By about week 12, the fusion of all of these structures should be completed so that the complete roof of the oral cavity, aka the palate, should be made up of the portion of the frontonasal prominence and the fusion of the palatine processes of the maxillary prominence. So again, demonstrating that the primary palate coming from the frontonasal prominence and the secondary palate coming from the palatine processes of the maxillary prominences. This dotted black line demonstrating the line of fusion that need to be completed by 12th week in development for us to have our complete and seamless palate. And extending anteriorly, we need the frontonasal prominence and the maxillary prominences to be completely fused with each other so that our face, or the anterior lip, so that we don't have cleft lip.